Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you very much for having chosen to come here this afternoon, or wherever you are, to listen to me. I realize, as they say on the airplanes, that you have choices. And I also wanted to thank our hosts, my hosts, Randy Schwartz, for inviting me to give this talk, and the library for making the space available. And I should apologize to the culinary historians of Ann Arbor who wanted me to talk about chestnuts, because 10 years ago I published a book about chestnuts. But as my colleague, now retired Ray Van Dam, used to say, those brain cells are dead. I don't remember anything about chestnuts anymore, but I have recently developed another more or less culinary project, and it's actually a COVIDian project having to do with all of the restrictions and funniness that we experienced when there was the COVID thing. And you'll remember that we all got interested in making bread and baking. In particular, my daughter did a lot of baking. And at the same time that COVID forced new communities to arise. And in my house, we, because of COVID, found ourselves with someone who suffers from, he doesn't like us to say it that way, from celiac disease, and is therefore extremely allergic to any form of wheat product, right? And so because this person is also a pious and practicing Catholic, this is a big deal for him, because he is unable to communicate. He's unable to participate in the central ritual of the Catholic faith. And that's why you'll find in my talk some references to the material Eucharist. In other words, I got interested during COVID in the relationship between the breads that we eat every day and the breads that some people eat on Sundays in a very special and ritualized form. And in particular, why the bread that we eat in ritualized form on Sundays, people like my son-in-law, actually, the celiac guy, hi Max, if you're watching, why the material form that this symbolic fact has to take has to contain wheat and become, therefore, an allergen. Basically, what we're saying is that God is an allergen. That's a few other preliminary remarks having to do with the pet peeves of someone like me. I'm a specialist in a recondite and remote part of the past, right? The Middle Ages, and that's bad enough. But worse than that, I'm a specialist in the early Middle Ages, which aren't even the glamorous Middle Ages. There's no knights, no shining armor, no castles, it's just barbarians, right? The early Middle Ages. So roughly a 500-year period between the collapse of the Roman organization of Europe and the better Middle Ages, the high Middle Ages that come later with knights and shining armor and all of that stuff, right? So periodization is actually going to be fairly important for this talk. I'm a historian, I'm interested in chronology, what happened when. So we're going to be talking mostly about the early Middle Ages. Once you get to the year 1000, you can breathe a sigh of relief, it's over, right? We don't need to. But it can be very, very complicated, as you see here. And what we should be focused on, I think, is this part here where I say Germany, Europe, France, Italy, what's going on over here. We're really going to be focusing on when it says France, Francia, Lombards, because once we get to 1000, we're not interested anymore. And the word that matters the most for us tonight is this one here, Carolingians, right? Because the thing that characterizes in our popular imagination, certainly, the early medieval period is a political fragmentation. The fact that the former unity of the Roman Empire came to an end, right, and was replaced by many competing polities, many little states that were in Europe that replaced the Roman Empire and were in a rough balance of power, but none of them were able to amass resources on a scale to actually rule the entirety of the territory, except the Carolingians, right? So the Carolingians are, from a status point of view, the heroes of the early Middle Ages, because they are the rulers, the dynasty of Frankish barbarians who did manage to bring it all together, more or less. So there you see a kind of an optimistic view of the Carolingian sovereignty, right? So time, early medieval, place, Europe, especially Carolingian Europe, because in this phase of European history, between the 8th and 9th century, not only was there political unification, but there's also, I would say, a reform of Christianity and Christian practice. And that's where the material Eucharist, the actual bread, the actual physical thing, I think was transformed in an important way. Now, the other thing I should say is that you'll be relieved. You can tell I'm a loquacious fellow. I'm actually going to read, because otherwise we'll be here much too late, I think. So I'm going to read and show you some pictures as I read. So it's A Tale of Two Breads. In the oldest biography of the Bishop of Rome, Gregory I, now known as Gregory the Great, the anonymous English author inserted a curious story. Writing around 700, so a century after this pope's death, the so-called monk of Whitby, that's all we know to call him, claimed that Gregory once noticed how one of the parishioners to whom he was administering communion giggled when he placed a consecrated morsel of bread in her mouth. Affronted, he extracted the piece of bread before she could swallow it and denied her communion. After the Mass, he interviewed the Roman matron to find out why she thought the bread was funny. He learned that she smiled because she recognized the bread he was claiming to be the body of Christ as a bit of the very same loaf she had made with her own hands and contributed to the altar in the offertorium, or ritual donation of bread and wine, and in the early Middle Ages, several other edibles, collectively known as oblations, that lay people made in the early phases of the Mass. Here's a picture of it. Now, there aren't good pictures from the early Middle Ages. It's called Dark Ages for a reason. Right? This is, however, from around 1050, sorry. It's the middle of the 11th century. It's from Rome, and it shows a miraculous event of a pope, an early pope, performing the Mass, so you can kind of get an idea of how it would be. And what's interesting about this image, the figures are about life size, it's a fresco on a wall in the subterranean part of San Clemente in Rome, is these two figures over here. Do you guess? No, you don't see the, are the two people here, and they're labeled. It's Beno della Pizza and his wife Maria. They're ordinary lay people, right? And they are at the altar, and they're bringing gifts to the altar. And so I guess that what's interesting to me about this fresco is that's a very rare early image of how lay people interact with the altar in ways that aren't necessarily Eucharistic. They're not receiving the sacrament. They're actually bringing stuff to the altar, right? And in this case, it's not bread and wine, but that would have been a fairly normal thing. On the right side of the picture, a miracle is going on, and the bad guy is being hauled off because he was trying to do wicked things, and he's not able to because the Pope is a holy saint. Right? So, in other words, the matron found incongruous the liturgical transformation of an everyday loaf. Well into the Dark Ages, it seems, ordinary homemade bread was accepted and used at Christian altars, where polished patens, silver and gold dishes, some of them bejeweled to emphasize the point, served to signal the bread's now exceptional status and prevent those in attendance from being tricked by the only apparent simplicity of the materials. A paten is a special kind of dish used to hold the bread that is consecrated, right? It's on the altar. And there are numerous examples from the Dark Ages, from the early Middle Ages. I'll show you some. Here's a silver one. Here's a more elaborate silver one. They can be of different sizes. This one that you're watching now is actually quite large. It's bigger than your biggest salad bowl, right? And it has an image of Jesus serving the apostles there. First communion. They can be simple, like this one, a 7th century from Rome, actually. This one is a Visigothic one, actually very elaborate. And this is my favorite of all. This is a Carolingian paten, the dish on which the holy bread is served at the Mass. And it's made out of a disc of marble with embossed little fishes. And then that's actually a piece of late antique craftsmanship. In other words, it's made in several centuries before the rest. Instead, the ring of gold and jewels around the fishes was made around the middle of the 800s in the Carolingian period. And here's a side view of this. If you want to see the actual thing, you have to go to the Louvre in France. It was made in France, this object. So anyway, patens, these are the dishes that signal to everybody that although it looks normal, the bread is not normal because it's on a very special surface. The papal masses of the 8th century, which are the earliest unambiguous attestations of ceremonial bread offerings at the altar by the laity, certainly make the practice of seem conventional, and as Roman ritual, the practice of donating bread at the beginning of the Mass by ordinary people, and as Roman ritual spread northwards with the sponsorship of the Frankish Carolingian dynasty, elaborate offertory processions by lay people were a standard part of the liturgy in many places beyond Rome. Hence, the Carolingian period Pope Nicholas I, he died in 867, could maintain that the miracle of God's physical presence amongst humans was best represented in the common bread used at communion, panis communis, everyday bread. That's the way we should do it. Now, Gregory's hagiographer recounted the episode because Gregory, the Pope, turned his interview with the lady who was giggling into a great teaching moment, convincing the matron of her error when the host that Gregory had providentially kept aside for the purpose began to bleed. This becomes a very famous story later. The early Middle Ages, they're not so excited, but in the High and Late Middle Ages, they really like this story, and they turn the story, the original story with just the lady who gets scolded and lectured, into the host actually becoming Jesus himself. This is a 13th century miniature. And then in this very lovely painting at Cleveland from 1511, Jesus is, the woman is the lady off to the side, dressed in red, and Jesus is virtually break dancing in his enthusiasm. Right? But beyond this rare trace of early medieval engagement with the mysteries of transubstantiation, the Monk of Whitby also shows readers that a 7th century woman was aware of the desecrating power in her hands. A large part of the incongruity the woman sensed derived from the contrast between the sanctifying manipulation of the holy bishop and the polluting effect her hands had on the flour, dough, and bread. Her baker's intimacy with the bread, her having mixed, kneaded, and held it with her hands, made the idea that it could be holy laughable to her. In early medieval Europe, hands were gendered binarily, as we would put it today, which rendered awkward the fact that in a world without commercial bread production, women manufactured most bread. Even the high status of the Roman matrona in the Monk of Whitby's lively account did not cleanse her hands enough to make them fit to receive the host. And the tale is often deployed in histories of oral versus manual reception of the host during Christian rituals. That became a hot topic in the late 20th century because the great council, Second Vatican Council in the 60s, ceased the old traditional, at that point traditional, custom of Catholics taking the host in their mouth. The priest put it sit in your mouth for you, and initiated the practice of the priest giving it to you in your hand, and you put it in your own mouth. So then this story becomes, oh, look, back then already Pope Gregory did it, so it must be good. Basically, that's the so. During Christian rituals. Late antique theologians had required laymen to wash their hands in order to take communion, but prohibited women receiving the consecrated bread in their bare hands at all, however thoroughly scrubbed. This is a cathedral, a basilica in Ravenna, Sant'Apollinare Nuovo, and it's a traditional basilica. I'm showing it because on the sides are these magnificent full-size representations of women, holy women. These are saints, these are martyrs that are carrying the crown of their victory over death and so on towards the altar, and you'll notice that their hands are shrouded, and that's really the point, that in the early Middle Ages, sorry, shouldn't have done that, in the early Middle Ages, hands, especially female hands, need to be covered whenever they're associating the hands with anything holy. The problem endured long enough that a council held at Cordoba in 839, so that's very late, censured clergy who handed hosts out to women. And in the 9th century conciliar gatherings, worries about which hands touched the consecrated host reached a fever pitch. Councils are the meetings where the Christian community settled the score and tried to figure out what's what. I suppose at U of M they usually come right back, but it takes, yeah, you see, it's a matter of patience. But this would be a Renaissance representation of a council that was held in the middle of the 5th century, gatherings of clergymen where the issues of theology are debated, where great decisions are made. And so what I'm seeing is that in the councils of the early Middle Ages, this issue of whether it's okay for women to touch with their hands at communion the holy bread is a hotly debated one, especially, I think, in the 9th century. Certainly, again, here's the big council that was held in Rome in the 1960s, the Second Vatican Council, right? It's the way proper councils should be done in St. Peter's Church. Certainly one part of the motivation for the distribution of consecrated bread into the communicant's mouth was that it ensured the bread was completely consumed on the spot and not taken elsewhere and used later without clerical supervision. And at the Cordoban Council of 839, this is actually stated explicitly. This form of administering the host also minimized unseemly spillage and waste, for the priest could ensure that few, if any, crumbs and fragments got away at consumption. Yet oral communion fundamentally depended on the ambiguous status of human hands, particularly of lay and female hands that might wander into unclean places before touching the divine in its bready form. If early medieval clergymen could control, at least in their texts, whether the host got into the wrong hands at the time of consumption, when all bread making was a domestic activity, it was not as easy to control production. Now, there was, in the ancient world, there is commercial bread making, right? So here's a tomb of someone. Those holes at the top of it are the holes for the urn into which with ashes inside. So it's a family tomb, and it's Mr. Nonius, and you'll see that carved onto the front of his tomb are the donkey and the mill. That's part of a bakery in the Roman world, right? That would have ground the grain. And on the other side, the various tools that are necessary for bread making. So there is a guy whose job characterizes his existence enough that on his family tomb, he puts the tools of his trade. That's how he makes his money, commercial bread making. In the early Middle Ages, there isn't commercial bread making. That's gone, right? Here's a very famous fresco from Pompeii of a bread shop, perhaps. Some people say it's actually the distribution of free bread because there isn't any sign of money going on. But anyway, there's a place where somebody who didn't make the bread acquires the bread on a large scale. There's a lot of bread in this image, right? Early medieval miracle stories generally assigned the manufacture of daily bread to women. In the life of Bishop Hucbert of Utrecht, who died around 743, kneading dough was both a female and a low-status job, and one that women were likely to carry out at the wrong time in their homes, as calculated by ecclesiastical calendars. The punishment was a painful crippling of the transgressive hands, the same one that Gregory of Tours, the 6th century impresario of St. Martin, responsible for propagating that saint's cults across Europe, reported for a free woman who mistimed her baking to coincide with a mandated day of rest. To circumvent such offenses and distinguish more clearly between kinds of bread, in the years leading up to 800, the powerful and well-connected Bishop of Orleans, Theodulf, a Carolingian, right, informed his diocesan clergy that they had two choices. Either they must make communion bread themselves, or they could have it made under their close personal supervision by one of their young male servants, presumed to be asexual, or anyway, not quite as lascivious is the word, as an adult was likely to be. Thereby, Theodulf attacked female bakers' physical intimacy, mediated through their hands, with the matter that would become Jesus' body. To Theodulf, and presumably to other early medieval clergymen, his provisions are very often included in 9th and 10th century bishops' instructions to their dioceses and the clergy therein. Purity was very much a matter of gender, a fact with important implications for bread making in a world without commercial outlets. But alas, not all male hands were so pure either. This is a magnificent 7th century mosaic, also life-size portraits of the Byzantine, of the Eastern Roman Emperor, making a donation to the local Ravennan bishop. Right? And what's interesting is that the hands here are being covered. The privilegia, the donation of property and rights and so on by the emperor to the bishop, the emperor's hand is naked. It's a sign of his privilege. But even a powerful man like the bishop feels that he must cover his hand while receiving the all-important document, the title to the goods that he's receiving. For example, the great monastic legislator of the early 800s, Benedict of Agnan, strictly distinguished the hands that kneaded the bread for Carolingian monks, which are monastic and clerical, from those that manipulated the flour for loaves lay dependents of the monastery would eat. Clerical status alone, it seemed, guaranteed that hands were truly clean. As Theodulf sought to control the whole process whereby Eucharistic bread came into being, he recognized that hands could spoil the host even prior to its consecration. Indeed, he seems to have considered that baking was part of the consecration process whereby the material became spiritual matter. That is why it had to be put into the right hands, chaste ones. Whether monastic vocation and virginity were potent enough to wash away feminine impurity is unclear, since early medieval nuns' involvement in Eucharist making is seldom attested. But hidden under the material Eucharist of the first millennium lay the contradiction that it was the purest and most exalted matter available, yet it was made at home, of common ingredients and generally by women. Hence, one development of our period, and specifically of the 8th and 9th centuries, was to begin removing women's hands from the dough that would become God at the altar. Theodulf, we have seen, moved decisively in this direction in the 790s, but left some leeway for any clergyman who thought making bread undignified, even when it was destined to communion. To avoid doing the domestic work of subaltern people, particularly females, these clergymen could co-opt boys for the task, as long as they stayed vigilant over the baking process and chose the youths carefully. Naturally, the imaginings of intransigent bishops did not effect instantaneous change in the manner of making liturgical breads, yet Theodulf's capitulary pointed the way to the future with ever more specialized manufacture of the host. A generation after Theodulf, Einhard, a friend and biographer of the Emperor Charlemagne, expected manors around Calais in northwestern France to have a dedicated male baker for the breads that will be offered at Mass. A related contemporary development was the increased attention for ritual cleaning of the officiant's hands prior to his handling the host during the Mass, visible already in the Ordo Romanus 4, a liturgical manual compiled in the 9th century in Francia and the Carolingian world from Roman materials. Here, you can look at this. It's a 13th century image, but there aren't that many from the liturgical scholar and Carolingian diplomat Amalarius of Metz, who died in 850, underlined the connection between such scrubbings before the sacrifices in the temple at Jerusalem recorded in the Hebrew scriptures and those expected of priests in the 9th century. Priestly hands were also singled out at the inception of a cleric's career. Carolingian ordination rituals for priests included the anointment of the new priest's hands. Some sacramentaries, these are handbooks for the clergy that guide them through the performance of liturgy, include prayers for this celebrating priest to intone, beseeching God to cleanse his hands as he prepared to administer communion. During the Carolingian and post-Carolingian Mass, at least as it was idealized in 9th and 10th century texts, the hands capable of touching the sacrifice, namely of lifting the bread, breaking it, and offering fragments to communicants, were carefully scrutinized, purified, and improved. The instructions in Ordo Romanus 10, the liturgical manual of the early 900s, repeatedly include ablutions necessary for touching the consecrated host. The celebrant needed to purge his hands of the earthly bread he received from the lay faithful in order to worthily manipulate the heavenly bread of communion. Though the process was long and never universal in the culturally and politically diverse Europe of those times, where every diocese could have its own liturgical traditions, between the 8th and the 11th century, increasingly it was men who dipped their hands into the flour, stirred the water, kneaded the dough, and shaped the loaves used in Christian ritual. And despite Ordo Romanus 10, during the 10th century, the custom of using oblatas, or bread donated by the faithful for the purpose, seems to have gradually lapsed and been forgotten, along with donations of other agricultural goods at the altar. Part of the reason for this development was not theological, for throughout the early Middle Ages, lay folk had not always been overjoyed by the duty to bring bread to Mass, And for example, the Council of Chelsea, 787, chastised people who contributed just a crust instead of proper bread, while a Bavarian council of around 800 encouraged the faithful not to feel bashful about their oblations and to contribute more generously. Yet in the 900s, several bishops complained of late recalcitrance, and other forms of donation became more common than the old and traditional bread and wine. Since the liturgical procession, whereby lay people brought their bready offerings to the altar, also appears to have gone into eclipse in many churches after the decline of the Carolingian Empire in the late 800s, we might hypothesize that the faithful lost sight of the symbolic dimension of their donation and resisted handing over their homemade loaves because it looked like a form of tithing, particularly when these did not reappear as consecrated host. Related to these developments, the redistribution of unconsecrated oblatas after Mass, prominent in Carolingian liturgical manuals, lapsed in later texts. The Ordo Romanus 10th date, as mentioned previously, the first decades of the 10th century, assigns this bready bounty to church wardens rather than to the general public. Other outcomes were possible, but the much-studied customary from Cluny, it's a famous monastery in Burgundy. It's a very lovely place, at least judging from the tourist board's photograph of it, detailing how the most scrupulous 11th century Christians made the bread for sacramental use, seems a fitting coronation to the early medieval trends I've been describing. It requires of the professed monks seed-by-seed selection of plump, unblemished grains of the very best wheat, ritual chanting to accompany their grinding and sifting, attention to exhalations and spittle flecks entering the dough, and special gloves to wear at key moments in the manufacturing process when even the purest hands might soil the mixture destined for divinization. This is how Cluny actually might have looked in the Middle Ages before it got demolished in the French Revolution. This is a 17th century drawing. It's the most famous monastic community in 10th and 11th century Europe, whose prayers were considered the very purest and best. And so the fact that at Cluny, they're making the hosts by 1050, by the 11th century, by choosing each seed and all the elaborate procedure I just described, is a sign of what was considered desirable, certainly at that point. All the hands involved in making Cluny's bread were men's, and almost all were monastic. It was all right, however, if the people who stoked the oven were ordinary laymen. It is not by chance that this fascinating text is coeval with the full emergence of the small, white, round, and flat host as the standard bread of communion. For that form of host has the signal advantage that it is not kneaded by hand, since its dough is liquid and can be stirred with spoons before being poured into circular concavities in a baking pan or iron press to produce, after a very light cooking that imparted no color, several identical flat breads. So here's a 14th century Swedish iron for making the host. You would pour the dough into each of those little circular spaces, and then you would heat it up in an oven at a low temperature, and you would get a flatbread that had the opposite of the imprint on its outer surface, on its crust. Right? The uniformly white, virtually identical hosts' hand-free manufacture and mass-produced appearance were integral to all Latin Christians' Eucharistic experience after the 11th century. The clean priestly fingers on the hosts at the altar might be the first human touch on this communion bread. There's the poster one. There's how the host was idealized in the 12th century, with Jesus holding it up at the Last Supper, right? Of course, there were some nostalgics, such as the reformer Bernald of Constance, he died in 1100, who found this transformation of the material Eucharist depressing. To him, the new millennium's tiny, thin, light, smooth hosts were too like coins, utterly unlike real bread in Bernald's Latin, veri panis. The clericalization of Eucharist manufacture, an outcome of theological changes in interpretation of the communion ritual, had required the invention and diffusion of breads so unbread-like that you could not make them at home. By the 1100s in sum, the great transformation of European Christian Eucharistic bread was essentially accomplished. The pallid wafer, still familiar to modern Catholics, had prevailed. At the beginning of the early Middle Ages, Christians' ritual bread had been indistinguishable from homey products people munched on to keep hunger at bay. But by the turn of the millennium, a cereal product quite unlike the food familiar to most households and made in a different way from everyday breads had taken its place in Christian churches. The dissimilarity was very apparent too. And when the officiant elevated the consecrated hosts at the altar, it could be measured with one's eyes. Not only was the newfangled Eucharistic bread smaller and flatter than ordinary breads, it was also far, far whiter. Now, bread's whiteness is a subject that we modern people know quite a lot about. Since the invention in the mid-1800s of roller mills, a new technology, right? It's a new way of grinding that since the invention in the mid-1800s of roller mills, which efficiently remove bran and germ from the endosperm, it has become possible to economically crush wheat into fine white flour that bakers transform into correspondingly white loaves. And it helps that much modern flour is made of hard wheat, that's a triticum durum, whose crushed particles are more evenly formed and easier to separate than other grains. Right, so there's a slide that shows you how we divide up grains. The germ and the bran are the stuff that we remove with our roller mills, and we're basically eating ground up endosperm. Right? European and American bakers' main motive for adopting roller-milled wheat flour was to satisfy urban consumers' growing demand for pale loaves, though there was also a beneficial side effect. Since the removal of the germ, where most of the fat in the grain is stored, also extended flour's shelf life, right? And that's the great advantage of this guy. But until the new technology arrived, manufacturing white flour had involved either costly seed selection of the kind the monks of Cluny applied to the grain destined to becoming hosts, or costly sifting that reduced the flour available for baking by a third to half. Again, sifting is an important part of the traditional process of making bread. And this very marvelous, probably tombstone, there isn't an inscription, so it's not complete. It comes from Ostia, the port of Rome. There's a bread shop, presumably. Those would be the breads to the side of the elbow there. And then overhead would be kind of an advertisement. And the one on your left is a sieve. In other words, a way for a commercial baker to say, this is a good place to buy your bread, is that I've got sieves. I actually sift the flour and remove the bran, because he didn't have a roller mill, so his flour was full of gunk, right? Full of horrible germ and bran, basically. So you could either, either you select all the seeds one by one, or you sift it carefully, or you do a doubly costly combination of both, though admittedly another possibility was the admixture into the yellowish or brownish flour of various chemicals that could have adverse effects on people's health and on the baker's reputations. In the course of the 20th century, therefore, a technological change democratized white bread until it became the norm, from which inevitably people, some of us, sought escape into whole wheat and other distinctive breads, right? So the implication of this slide is that all the good stuff has been removed by refining the grain, by milling it in the roller mill. Though the old-fashioned, often homemade, darker breads of yore contained more of the nutritive properties of the grains from which they were made, the new commercial white breads had higher social status because for centuries eaters of brown, gray, and dark bread had observed their social betters eating whiter loaves made of sifted flour. Christians had also seen and occasionally tasted the white coin-like host at the altar during communion, which may have contributed to the desirability of pale grain products during the second millennium. That's this guy again. Ironically then, the modern commercialization and industrialization of bread manufacture has ended up upholding medieval clerical ideas of bread quality, white, based on completely different standards and processes of loaf production. Now, the increasingly acute need to offer at Christian altars sacramental bread of special quality that I've reconstructed in this presentation developed alongside the rising status and increasing clericalization of the communion event during the early Middle Ages. In the course of that period, bread came in many forms and sizes, more or less leavened, and I guess we'll taste some any moment now. Round or baked in square tins, and above all, of different hues. Here's a rare early medieval representation of breads, a 6th century mosaic from Ravenna. The breads are on the table of the mysterious 3 visitors to Abraham and Sarah. Sarah is in the kitchen still, but she presumably is the author of those breads. And those are breads that have incisions on them. They're, in Latin, they would be called panis quadratus, in other words, crossed, squared, divided into 4 breads, and they made it possible to divide the bread up without a knife, basically, because they're already pre-segmented, right? So medieval bakers tended to mix diverse types of flour into their bread, so they obtained different gradations of color in them. Of course, from the outside, most baked loaves will have looked dark. But once broken open, as Christian accounts of the Last Supper suggested Jesus had done in order to offer each of his disciples a share, breads revealed their differences. Much of the visible difference derived from the flour bakers used to confect the loaf, whether it had been sifted and how thoroughly, and therefore how white the crumb looked. Since pre-modern people knew precious few natural or artificial white things, their understanding of bread's whiteness was in any case forgiving. But that's because chemical bleaches are a 19th century invention. Until you get those, it's very difficult to create white. But the persistence of lots of bits of bran and germ in all flours before the 1800s introduction of roller mills meant that pre-industrial flour and its elaborations were never pure white. However, the flour of soft wheat, whose scientific name is Triticum aestivum, came close to the perfection of candor, provided the right cultivar had been chosen, its palest seeds had been selected, grinding was done in mills with well-dressed stones and a regular source of power, adequate bolting or sifting was performed after the milling, and some aging of the flour had allowed further bleaching. Great care, in other words, went into separating the main ingredient in the perfect bread from that in the staff of everyday life. Harder to obtain in pre-industrial Europe, such candid bread was costly and so rare and prestigious. Today, we pay attention to how red and white soft wheat cultivars have different pigments in the layer of coloring cells around the endosperm, right? So that would be, it's the outside thing. So they're actually agronomic categories. This is a red wheat, this is a... which affects the hue of any meal made from them. That different strains of wheat gave variably white flour was not, however, noticed by early medieval writers, even those interested in host-worthy flour. When, in the mid-800s, in a strange treatise about the host, the enigmatic Iberian bishop Ildefonsus, about whom we don't know anything else, called the wheat used for making hosts our blue wheat, he alas omitted to explain what that meant, or how the cultivar mattered in the host preparation. As Ildefonsus's contemporary, the Carolingian abbot Paschasius Radbertus, had suggested it was frivolous to dwell on the color of bread at communion, it was certainly possible to remain indifferent to such questions. Yet the Germanic languages, including English, preserved the linkage that early medieval native speakers perceived between whiteness and wheat flour. In northwestern Europe, then, the characteristic that seemed most striking and evident, the one that set wheaten baked products apart from those confected using barley, emmer, or even spelt, was their pallor. Rather than any botanical or agronomical differences, the color of the flour obtained by grinding wheat assigned its Germanic name to a plant that was a relative newcomer in northwestern European fields. It's true that some soft wheat flours are darker than others because of their kernel's pigmentation. And some other grains, and mostly hulled wheats, for example, emmer, that's this guy, which you can buy at the shop. They usually call it farro. Adequately treated render still more brilliant flour than does soft wheat. Yet first millennium people, at least the ones who wrote anything, noticed and appreciated above all the whiteness of Triticum aestivum flour. In consequence, from the beginning of the early medieval period, Christian writers extolled the snowy and milky candor of wheat breads. In this, they refined a strain in ancient Hebrew and ancient Roman bread thinking, which assigned importance to bread's light coloration and associated whiteness in crumb with exclusivity and quality. For most of Europe, the 8th and the 9th centuries are better documented than the previous ones, which may color reconstructions of the history of the Eucharist, material and otherwise. As it stands, the extant evidence leaves the impression that in the 9th century, Carolingian clergymen, who also participated in the first Eucharistic controversy of the Middle Ages, made Christians' earliest concerted effort to have bread at the altar whose materiality reflected ever more rigid theological convictions, and therefore was ever more wheaten and white. We have seen their interest in who handled the bread even prior to consecration. The great mid-20th century scholar of Christian liturgy, an Austrian called Josef Jungmann, maintained that the importation of the Roman rite into the Frankish Carolingian Empire coincided with reduced lay participation in the Mass, increasingly a clerical preserve. The old-style donation by the faithful of agricultural goods and common, not-so-white bread at the altar fell into forgetfulness. Here's a Taquinum, sometimes a text that circulates widely in medieval Europe and is always illustrated. It's a health manual, how to stay healthy. It's a medical treatise. And in this 14th century one from England, there's a professional baker again. So we're back into the world where there are people who make money by making and selling bread. And you'll see that the loaves are pretty white, except when they're baked, at which point they have that brownness, which would no longer have been acceptable at the altar. This is perhaps the best context within which to set the odd story at the end of Agnellus's serial biography of the bishops of Ravenna, in which, among several other obvious portents that proved Bishop George unworthy, the guy died in 846, like blood rain and weird behavior of the stars, one Sunday morning, the bread baking in the ovens of some high-status people began to rattle and then emerged looking dirty. Indeed, the bread offerings that day, including those from the bishop's oven, looked dusky and sooty, which rendered them completely inappropriate for liturgical use. Agnellus, who claimed to have seen some of what transpired with his own eyes, interpreted the unnatural events as warnings and invitations to amend sinful human ways, particularly those of Bishop George, against whom the bread was rebelling by refusing to collaborate with his communion plans. To Agnellus and his readers, I think, in the late 800s, it seemed obvious that dark breads had no place at Christian altars. 8th and 9th century texts also more coherently tackle the issue of purity in sacramental bread ingredients than had any Christian writings of previous times. A letter of Alcuin, Charlemagne's English friend and advisor, contains the first explicit reference to use of azyme, or unleavened bread at communion, presumably a precursor of the flat host that became a bone of contention between Eastern and Western Christians in the 11th century. In an aside, the erudite English monk Bede had suggested that the sacrifices at the temple in Jerusalem, described by the scriptures, involved unleavened bread, so probably Christian altar bread should follow suit. But his was not a prescription, and it lacked Alcuin's peremptory tone. After Alcuin, several 9th century Carolingian thinkers argued for the preferability of azyme hosts, trotting out the soon-to-become standard references to a Pauline epistles, 1 Corinthians 5, verses 6 to 7, in which leavening, in Latin fermentum, is suspected of corrupting otherwise pure dough, made only with water and flour. They also sustained the traditional early Christian position that bread was the perfect symbol of Christian communion because its basic ingredient, flour, was a union of many individual grains ground up and bound together exclusively by clean water. They thereby sidestepped the equally traditional idea that leaven was good, a symbol of the uplift Christians were supposed to be in the world, and of the effect the Holy Spirit had there. Indeed, leavening could be excellent, and the late antique Church of Rome called fermentum the particles of consecrated bread that the bishop sent on specified feasts to all parishes within the city walls, signifying the unity of the community. Clearly, what counted as pure bread, worthy of Christian ritual, remained unsettled in the first millennium. After all, purity is an elastic and malleable concept, rather like well-proofed bread dough. Still, Carolingian clergymen articulated a vision of altar bread's material purity that was more confident, more stringent than their predecessors. Here's some of those Carolingian clergymen in a contemporary illumination from a manuscript painted in 831 at Fulda. It shows Alcuin, the guy with the who's introducing his friend Paschasius Robertus, who is making an offering of a book to the bishop, the boss, right? So those are Carolingian big shot clergymen. For the first time in the early medieval record, a consistent discourse described the host as white, a color term with a long history of religious associations and linkages with purity, hygiene, and health. 8th and 9th century clerics' conviction that consecrated hosts must be pure and pallid and distinct from people's daily breads aligned with the contemporary sense of the terribleness of God's altars and of human activities there. The new awe swept up the old homey breads made by female hands in ordinary hearths with readily available ingredients. From around 800, the host was supposed to be unlike people's daily bread, to be smaller, to be unleavened, and especially to be whiter. The pursuit of bread, whose origins and appearance manifested its exceptional status and potency, did not, however, immediately attain success. It took at least 3 centuries in a fitful and slow process for white wheat flatbread gradually to find its way from the texts of the clergymen to the great cathedrals and monasteries, and finally to the remotest rural churches in Europe. And so what I've argued this afternoon is that only in the 11th century did European sacred and daily loaves diverge for good. That's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, Professor Squatrini. Very stimulating talk. I think Steve's going to moderate a Q&A session.
So if you do have any questions, we would again ask that you raise your hand. We'll bring you the mic, and if you can ask your question into the microphone so the 100+ viewers who are watching this online can also capture the question as well as the recorded stream. So again, if you have any questions for Professor Squatrini, please raise your hand. We'll be happy to get you the mic.
Thank you. Do you know when in history the phrase fruit of the earth and work of human hands became a part of the Eucharistic liturgy?
No, I'm sorry. I'm not a liturgistic scholar, so liturgies tend to be fairly conservative, so it's probably from very far back, but I don't know. Sorry.
I find that
why
to
do you
be
ask?
a funny dichotomy, that there's sort of an effort to remove the humanness and specifically the handedness from the liturgy when it's like written in the words.
Yeah.
Thanks. This was really interesting. I wanted to go back to your opening story about the woman giggling, and I hadn't yet been clued into the mouth versus hand issue. So I wondered, two things. Can you remind us, was he putting it in her mouth or was he handing it to her hand? And the other was so interesting that she was laughing about the everydayness of the bread, because that's the essence of magical transformation, right? Is you take an ordinary ingredient like an apple and you bewitch it, and then it becomes a magical ingredient. And sacraments have that same transformative quality, but she wasn't going there. She was saying, no, this is the bread I made this morning, and here it is. So I wonder if there's any thinking about that.
Thank you for the question. There are 3 versions of that story. So I went with the earliest one, the one that was written in England about 100 years after the event might have happened. The other 2 ones change the story slightly, whether she's giggling or smiling, or there are details like that change. But yeah, they all suggest that he had put it in her mouth, And that's a little unusual for the time, and that's why in the 20th century, and when people are debating whether the reforms of Vatican II are appropriate or inappropriate, this becomes look how long ago they were doing the thing that we think the Vatican II has incorrectly stopped doing. That's but it's very unusual. All the other evidence from the period suggests that it's hands, and covered hands in the case of women, that are involved. So that story is unique, and that's why it's talked about a lot, because it's so ancient. It's an ancient reference to a thing that becomes much more common later. And since it involves a pope that everybody looks up to, Gregory I, a very famous pope, then it becomes even more authoritative that way. And as to the magical transformation, yeah, she's not going there. She thinks it's just bread, or at least that's what the clerical tradition wants to project into the female laity of a long time ago, right? Because that would be, it's a nice point that you make about the magical transformations and the ordinariness there. I guess she would have had this fancy plate in front of her, which I think was designed to make it obvious that this isn't just the bread that you made. And then he puts some of it in her, and she doesn't. She still recognizes her bread. Right?
One quick observation. Somebody online pointed out to the previous question, saying that phrase was added by Paul VI at Vatican II. It is taken from the Jewish tradition of the blessing prayers. So you can look into that yourself.
I was wondering what did Jesus use at the Last Supper? And why don't we use what he used?
It's a good question, and it's a question that many people have posed for a very long time. So in the Carolingian period, they became increasingly convinced that he had had a Passover unleavened bread. Right? But that's related to what I see as a big transformation in that Carolingian period of the whole ritual. It's not just that. They want the ritual to be a much more exalted thing. I think in the first generations after Jesus, they were a lot more relaxed about that ritual. And it was a ritual of eating together. And so I imagine that they got whatever they could get their hands on. But these are all reconstructions and speculations, because the Christian record of what Jesus did comes from some decades after Jesus did it, right? And then on top of that, there are all the accretions and debates of the Christians who came after, and so it's a very hotly contested subject, what exactly happened way back when. And it's a question that is a perfectly valid one, and Christians have asked it a lot, including in this period. That's what one of the issues is bead, and they're trying to say, well, what were they doing, those Hebrews? We know that Jesus was a Jew, and what would they have been doing on Passover? And so let's try to be authentic, right? That would be one view of it. And the other one would say, well, we're just commemorating an event. We're hanging out together. We're showing our union by eating bread together. That would be another way of imagining it. So there are different positions, I think, on that. Because I guess the written tradition is not unequivocal. That would be, you have a position on that you want?
On regard the question that came before, I was thinking that, today, apparently, from a Pew research, 70% of the Catholic don't believe that that's Jesus. Therefore, the woman was not really so strange. Apparently, there is an elevated number of Catholics that don't believe, and therefore, maybe the priest, the bishop, or whoever it was, had good reason to remove from her hands or mouth the host. today is mandatory to remove the host if someone shows disrespect, immediate disrespect at the altar. So it's a kind of a common thing, just to let you know.
Yeah, of course, the teaching moment part of it is precisely that the lack of respect is corrected by the administrating priest, by the Pope, and that he sets it all straight. She's converted, she understands that it really is, and so her belief is set straight. How we know whether other 7th or 8th century people, what they actually believed.
Thank you so much, Professor Squarciati. This was really interesting. I have a question, a sort of texture question, which is, in my own limited religious education, it was always, you get the wafer, you do not chew on it, right? You're supposed to let it dissolve in your mouth, or at least that was what I was taught, because you're not chomping on Christ's body there, right? That seems less possible with the early 9th century bread that you're talking about, and I just wonder if maybe you can say something about maybe the evolution of that idea and how it,
No, that's a nice question. It has to do, I think, with this Carolingian period awe about the whole event. It's not anymore a friendly gathering of us to say, hey, we believe that this person existed in the past and he did it, and to remember that, we're just going to get together and do something that reminds us of that. Instead, I think in the Carolingian epoch, they're beginning to see this event as a very highly charged spiritual encounter between human and divine, and so it's a different view. It turned out to be the one that prevailed, and I think what I was trying to point out is that this seems to be the point where the change happens.
I wanted to ask, you mentioned that commercial baking ceased to be in the period after the collapse of the empire. And I wanted to ask about the return of commercial baking, if you can approximately date that or describe it.
I said I stop at 1,000, right? But it probably has to do with urbanism, right? It has to do with the density of the urban form's presence in the landscape, so that when everybody is fundamental, I don't want to exaggerate, but when there's a lot more self-sufficiency and everybody is basically eating the things that they make, that's the rural world of the early Middle Ages with very few urban conglomerations. Rome would be an exception, because even, Rome had 40,000 people living in it, even in the doldrums of it. But for the rest, most people are living in face-to-face communities where 1,000 is a lot of people living together, and they're all eating things that they make. So I think that the return of the city, 11th, 12th, 13th century, is related to the return of commercial bakery, probably. But is that what you're thinking?
Thank you so much. Hi, Paolo. This was so interesting. And so I was sort of surprised this had never occurred to me before, but that when you were talking about the emergence of this white communion wafer, and kind of going off the questions we just heard, I began thinking about transubstantiation and what happens when we imagine that white communion wafer as the literal flesh of Christ. And does that track with new ways of actually imagining what his flesh looks like? Does his flesh become whiter? Like, how do we even think about that? Or is that not a question that really makes sense in the theological world that you're working on? Thanks.
No, I think it makes sense. There are some Carolingian people who say because apparently you have to reconstruct, but they're arguing against someone else whose voice is lost. But someone else seems to say, well, if it's his body, why isn't it red, and why doesn't it taste like meat? And so they're saying it shouldn't. Don't pay attention to that. That's not the point, right? So I think you're right. They do worry about that. That there is someone out there with a theological voice, because these high-ranking theologians aren't listening to ordinary people on the street. They're actually talking to each other. Who it was, I'm not sure, but Pascal de Sorbertus, one of the big shots of the 9th century theological debates, he says, don't pay attention to whether it tastes like meat and whether it looks like meat. So they are worried about it. And probably that is an anxiety that would have to come at a time when you're trying to enforce the idea that this is really something more than a piece of bread that we're sharing because we're Christians.
At the risk of stepping a little bit outside of the scope of the talk, I'm curious if your research you found a similar concern and effort to delineate the use of sacramental wine and wine used for secular purposes, or if whatever controversies might exist are fundamentally different than the one we learned about today in terms of the sacramental bread.
That's a nice question. Thank you. Yeah, I should know more about it because they often talk about it together. But it seems like the wine is never as controversial. So they don't even tell you whether it's supposed to be red or white. They're very adamant that you shouldn't mix anything in except water, because apparently in some traditions, I think there are some, I think in some Orthodox traditions there were other admixtures, I think honeys, there were other sweeteners that were added, so that the wine itself would then be a radically different ingredient. Its materiality would be unlike the ordinary wine that you drank at home. But in the Western tradition, and in fact in most Orthodox traditions, it's pretty rigid, just water. And it seems to be not as worrisome a subject, which is, I think that's what you're pointing out. It's interesting. Why is the wine so uncontroversial, whereas the bread they worry a lot about? And a material Eucharist has to involve the wine too. It's the whole packet, right?
Hi, thank you. Once the clergy takes over the baking of the bread, is there changes in their facilities for doing so? That, you know, we're now cooking this or baking this special bread. We're going to have a new special place to bake it. And are the implements used there created by clergy or controlled in some way? And then related to that is the process of actually doing this is to become more private and protected from people watching it because it's this special process.
I think yes. The archaeology of ovens and baking is poor, as far as I can tell. I've looked around; it's not very well. And a colleague at the University of Oregon thinks that that's because actually ovens were not very common, and that most people didn't bake leavened breads; that they were eating flat breads all the time. I disagree, but she may be right. In terms of the specialness of the equipment, I think when that customary from Cluny from around the middle of the 11th century, that's all about that. That is a very special ritual, and it requires special equipment and designated people, and there's a provision there that the number of monks hanging out around the oven, just hanging out while it has to be small. They don't want any chit chat while it's going on. So I think that the professionalization of the manufacturer comes with all kinds of other adjustments to the process, to the equipment. I think that the same oven that makes the bread for the rest of the week, I think, is used for this purpose. But they scrupulously clean it before. And they don't want that ordinary ash or flour to get mixed in.
Thank you, Paolo. This was terrific. So I have a comment and a question. So in the later Middle Ages, ordinary people don't take communion in both kinds. They only take it in the bread. They don't get the wine. And so maybe that's one of the reasons why the wine is just not as controversial.
Yeah.
But my question is that this removing women from the manufacturing of the bread seems to also track with the rise in concerns over celibate clergy in the larger world. I mean, I know monks are celibate, but they're also, Cluny's big innovation is that they also become priests. Right. So what happens when you throw in all of that stuff?
No, it's true. I think that in the High Middle Ages, that's already a world in which the event, the communion event, has been so sacralized that you couldn't possibly drink the wine. I think in the early Middle Ages, it's a little more easygoing about it. But yeah, the point about your question about removing the women and its tracking with the sort of celibacy. This happens a little earlier, right? Because it's really the 11th century before, whereas the Carolingians, they're perfectly at ease with lots of married priests. There's all kinds of priests, whom they sometimes disapprove of, but they are there. And there's no concerted effort to root them out and get rid of them as in the church reform of the 11th century. So maybe it's an earlier form of sexualized, saying that these bodies are worse than those bodies are less pure. It comes a little before the shift towards a celibate male clergy that has no sexual alliances and so on. So I'm not sure why exactly. I don't know if you've noticed, but I don't really have an explanation of why the Carolingians are the ones who do this. Do all empires like them? But it does seem to be happening.
I have another question this time. So the Orthodox keep the bread today, and I was wondering what happens at that time, because they were separated, if I'm not wrong, in 1054. So what happened to them before? Did they went towards something different, or they stayed with the bread forever?
So I think the Orthodox material Eucharist is more stable. So they always had bread, and they stayed with bread, as far as I can. So that the issue in the 1054 is that suddenly the Latins aren't doing bread anymore, and they're saying, wait, what are you guys doing with this funny disc? And because it was a relatively novel phenomenon for the Latins, it had gotten to a critical mass, maybe had been attained, where not just a few churches, but lots of churches were using it, enough that it was a distinguishing mark. It became something that stood apart. In the Orthodox world, really interesting are the bread stamps, so that the bread that is used in the Orthodox is marked in a way that it distinguishes. It's the same ingredients, but it has a mark on its crust that makes it the ritual bread, not all of which gets used in communion, and what's left over is distributed as in the Latin church, at least in the early medieval one. But it is with I think it's the Jesus Christ brings victories. I see, those letters. That's the usual one. It's a cross with 8 letters in each of the 4 divisions. Kind of like the Panis Quadratus, but Christianized, basically.
Not a question, but I realize that many people here don't have the benefit of a Catholic upbringing and may not realize that some of the things you're talking about survived well into our time. When I made my first communion in the 1950s, I was assured by many of my friends that a little boy in the next parish over, just last year, had bitten on the host during his first communion, and blood poured from his mouth. And we only wish that Gregory the Great had been there to see it.
Where was this?
It was in Ohio.
Ohio, yeah. Well, the bleeding host, yeah, that's a classic. And what's interesting about the story of Gregory, the opening story, is that it becomes part of that bleeding host story, which it isn't to begin with. in the early Middle Ages, they're not worried about bleeding hosts, really. It's really about telling the lady that something serious is happening. And the bleeding host, part of that story is why there are so many depictions of it. It's such a popular subject, because in the late medieval world, and I guess in Ohio, that was the thing that was decisive.
Thanks, Paulo, for the fascinating talk. I guess that my question, maybe it's an unfair question because maybe there are no evidence, but my question is about the process in which these changes get disseminated, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about it. I take it that you describe a process that took centuries, but I was wondering, are there any indications, for example, that for enforcement, that local churches are being told to do that, or do we have any?
Yeah, it's a typical question of well, I think that guy Bernold, because he dies in 1100. He's the one who says this isn't real bread. It's not what he actually talks about the bread that in my mother's home. He said it's not the stuff. And so you could say that he's definitely on the team of the papal reform. He's all for the clerical celibacy and all that stuff. But the stuff of the bread, and if someone that important, that high-ranking, with such a brilliant career, is still feeling a little whimsical, a little nostalgic about how it used to be, it means that there was something greater. But that's the only example I know. I'm sure if you looked, you would find some other people. There are fascinating studies of 16th century England where they didn't like it one bit when they took away the host. They wanted that because they were familiar, right? So the opposite, but the same process. And there's all kinds of, lots of evidence, and it's hard fought. It's a couple of generations before finally you get to the remotest parish in Cornwall or something and get them onto the just a piece of bread page.
I think we have time for a couple more questions, I think.
I hesitate to say this because I don't know exactly where I read it, but I thought I read something about the reason that priests didn't marry had to do with keeping the real estate in the church, because if they married, then when they died, the real estate would go to the wife.
Or the children. Yeah, I think there are various. It's possible. The sacrosanctity of the property of the corporation called church, the fact that it cannot be treated as private property, I think that's very ancient. And that goes way beyond the celibacy of priests, so that even in the early Middle Ages, the notion is that St. Peter owns the land, or St. Maurice, or whoever is the local, and that belongs to this abstract unit called church, and so no individual may appropriate it. Of course, that doesn't mean in the early Middle Ages the way you get around that is that you make sure that your brother, your uncle, whoever the Lord is, makes sure that one of his family is the abbot, is the abbess, is the bishop, so that he has control of the resources, even if mediated through the relative. But the idea that you could then buy and sell the property of the saint, they don't seem to like that, even before there was celibacy.
Thanks. I'm back again. I was thinking about the comment about allowing the host to dissolve in your mouth rather than chewing on it, and the materiality of this wafer that you've described taking shape. You couldn't have the bread dissolve previously. So it seems like it's a place where theology produces a kind of material change, which then allows the development of a theological change. I don't know if that makes sense, or they're developing separately.
No, I like that. This sort of dialectic. Yeah, well, it may be a bit chicken eggy kind of thing, but yeah, that the world of ideas creates a model of how it ought to be, which affects the reality, and then the reality confirms the and onward and onward. But yeah, I think you're right. I'm pretty sure that early medieval people felt perfectly comfortable chomping on the bread. I don't think that they were, because for them it wasn't yet this exalted matter.